Death had a way of interrupting dinner, and tonight it wore the face of three men with guns. Jin Wukong barely glanced up from his perfectly prepared wagyu as the restaurant's ambient lighting caught the metallic glint of weapons being drawn across the dining room. The Golden Chrysanthemum was the kind of establishment where reservations required a month's notice and a background check, where crystal stemware caught candlelight like captured stars, and every surface whispered of old money and older secrets. It was also neutral territory, which made the breach of protocol currently unfolding not just dangerous, but personally insulting. Wherever you're watching this from tonight, whether it's a cozy living room in Ohio or a bustling coffee shop in California, imagine the most expensive restaurant in your city. Now imagine that sanctuary of luxury suddenly becoming a battlefield. Comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from. Jinwoo's fingers remained steady on his glass of Macallan, the amber liquid catching the light as his dark eyes swept the room with predatory calculation. 27 years of surviving in this world had taught him that showing fear was a luxury he couldn't afford, especially not when Kim Tae-hyun sat across from him, discussing the terms of their newest shipping arrangement. The older man's weathered face had gone ashen, but Jinwoo's expression remained as controlled as his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. The scent of seared beef and truffle oil mingled with the sharp tang of adrenaline as three figures moved with lethal purpose through the maze of white-clothed tables. Other diners froze mid-conversation, wine glasses suspended halfway to lips, as if the simple act of not moving might render them invisible to the unfolding violence. This was supposed to be a simple business dinner. Taehyun controlled the docks, Jinwoo managed distribution, and their arrangement had kept both families prosperous for the better part of a decade. The Golden Chrysanthemum had hosted their monthly meetings for 3 years without incident, its owner understanding that certain conversations required absolute discretion and uncompromising security. Clearly, someone had decided to rewrite the rules. Zara Williams balanced 6 plates on her left arm and 2 more in her right hand, navigating between tables 12 and 14 with the fluid grace of someone who had perfected the art of efficient movement in cramped spaces. The Golden Chrysanthemum was her Thursday night shift, a world away from the corner diner where she pulled doubles on weekends and the catering company where she picked up extra work whenever her mother's medical bills climbed too high. She'd been moving between worlds her entire 24 years, code-switching between the rough edges of East Atlanta and the polished expectations of establishments like this one, where a natural elegance and quick mind earned her the kind of tips that made the difference between keeping the lights on and choosing between electricity and groceries. The burgundy uniform hugged her curves without being provocative, the color complementing the warm undertones of her dark skin, and she'd learned to carry herself with just enough confident professionalism to earn respect from both kitchen staff and clientele. Her thick hair was pulled back in a sleek bun that would survive a 12-hour shift, and her smile remained genuine despite the ache in her feet from standing since 6 that morning. She noticed the change in atmosphere before she understood what was causing it. Conversations dropped to whispers, then to nothing at all, the kind of weighted silence that made her skin prickle with instinctive alarm. Her grandmother had called it the gift, this ability to sense danger before it fully materialized, and tonight it screamed warnings through every nerve ending. The 3 men moving through the dining room wore expensive suits that couldn't quite hide the bulk of concealed weapons, their movements too coordinated to be casual diners, too focused to be lost tourists. Zara's grip tightened on the plates as her mind raced through possibilities, calculating distances to exits and wondering if the kitchen staff had noticed the shift in energy. She was setting down the last plate at table 14 when the first gun appeared, sliding from beneath a jacket like a serpent emerging from silk. The businessman dining alone at table 9 made a choked sound, his face draining of color as he recognized what was happening. Other patrons began to understand, chairs scraping against marble floors as people rose in sudden panic. The maitre d' stepped forward with admirable composure, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had diffused countless situations involving too much wine and wounded egos. "Sir, I must ask you to," he began, his words cutting off abruptly as the second weapon emerged, then the third. Zara found herself moving before conscious thought kicked in, her body angling toward the table where two men sat in conversation, their postures suggesting this wasn't a social dinner, but a business arrangement of the kind that required privacy and protection. The younger man's dark eyes met hers across the space between them, and she saw recognition flicker in their depths, not of her personally, but of the situation unfolding around them. Time compressed into crystalline moments of perfect clarity. She watched the lead gunman's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the muzzle swing toward the table where the two men sat with predatory calm, registered the split second when deadly intent became deadly action. Later, she would wonder what possessed her to move. What combination of instinct and circumstance sent her diving across the space between tables as the first shot exploded through the refined air of the golden chrysanthemum? Perhaps it was the way the younger man had looked at her, without the casual dismissal she'd grown accustomed to from wealthy diners. Or perhaps it was simply that she'd spent her entire life protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The impact drove her to her knees beside his chair as gunfire erupted through the dining room, shattering crystal and splintering wood, turning the sanctuary of luxury into a war zone in the space of heartbeats. She felt his hand on her shoulder, firm and surprisingly gentle, pulling her down behind the dubious protection of their overturned table as chaos consumed the golden chrysanthemum. His voice was steady and controlled when he spoke, cutting through the screams and shattering glass with quiet authority. "Stay down," he commanded, and she realized that despite the violence exploding around them, despite the fact that she was a complete stranger who had just thrown herself into mortal danger to protect him, he was already thinking 3 steps ahead, already calculating their survival. The scent of his cologne mixed with gunpowder and fear, sandalwood and bergamot, creating an incongruously peaceful anchor in the storm of violence. She pressed against the solid warmth of his shoulder, feeling the controlled tension in his muscles, the way he held himself ready to move, to act, to become something more dangerous than the men trying to kill him. Return fire came from somewhere behind them, precise and devastating, cutting through the attacker's assault with surgical efficiency. Jinwoo's security detail had been positioned throughout the restaurant, invisible until needed, and now they moved with the lethal grace of men who had trained for exactly this scenario. The battle lasted perhaps 90 seconds, though it felt like hours compressed into moments of surreal clarity. When the gunfire finally stopped, the golden chrysanthemum looked like a beautiful woman after a violent assault, her elegance shattered but not entirely destroyed, marble floors littered with crystal fragments and overturned furniture. Jinwoo rose slowly, his movements controlled and fluid as he surveyed the aftermath. 3 men lay motionless among the wreckage, their expensive suits dark with blood, their weapons scattered across marble that had cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. His security team was already moving through the restaurant, checking for additional threats, coordinating with management to control the narrative that would emerge from this breach of neutral territory. He looked down at the woman who had saved his life, this stranger who had sacrificed her safety for his without hesitation or calculation, and felt something shift in the carefully controlled landscape of his existence. She was rising to her knees beside the overturned table, her uniform torn but not destroyed, her dark eyes wide with shock but alert with intelligence. "You are hurt," he observed, noting the scrape on her forearm where she had hit the marble floor, the way she favored her left side where his weight had knocked her against the table leg. The question was not a question, but a statement, delivered in accented English that carried traces of Seoul private schools and American business colleges. Zara shook her head, then immediately regretted the movement as her vision wavered. "I'm fine," she managed, though fine seemed an inadequate word to describe surviving an assassination attempt while serving the evening specials. The absurdity of it struck her suddenly, the disconnect between setting down plates of wagyu and diving behind furniture to avoid bullets. She looked around the destroyed restaurant, at the security team moving with military precision through the wreckage, at the man whose life she had saved standing over her like a dark angel in a charcoal suit. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in, along with the understanding that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Jinwoo extended his hand to help her stand, the gesture courteous but tinged with something deeper, a recognition that what had passed between them in those violent moments had created a bond that transcended the usual boundaries between strangers. When she placed her hand in his, feeling the callous strength of fingers that had known violence and power in equal measure, she realized that the collision between their worlds was only beginning. The police arrived exactly 23 minutes after the last shot was fired, which told Jinwoo everything he needed to know about how thoroughly his enemies had planned tonight's assault. In the controlled chaos of sirens and flashing lights that followed, as investigators photographed bloodstains and collected shell casings from marble that would never quite shine the same way again, he watched Zara Williams answer questions with the kind of careful precision that suggested she understood the weight of her words. She sat in the restaurant manager's office, her torn uniform replaced with a golden chrysanthemum staff jacket that hung loose on her frame, her natural poise intact despite the shock that still lingered in her dark eyes. Detective Morrison, a weathered man whose rumpled suit suggested too many late nights chasing cases that led nowhere, leaned forward with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. The woman had saved his life without hesitation or calculation, throwing herself in mortal danger for a stranger whose name she didn't know, whose world she couldn't possibly understand. Now she was answering questions about trajectory and timing while crime scene photographers captured evidence that would disappear in files marked closed within the week, because certain kinds of violence in certain kinds of establishments followed certain kinds of protocols. Jinwoo's security chief, Park Min-jun, appeared at his elbow with the silent efficiency that had kept both men alive through a decade of territorial disputes and succession challenges. "The situation is contained," Park reported in rapid Korean, his scarred face betraying no emotion as he delivered information that would reshape the landscape of their operations. The shooters were Yamamoto's men, freelance work based on the weapons and approach. Someone paid them well to breach neutral territory. The implications settled around Jinwoo like winter fog, cold and obscuring. If Yamamoto's people had been willing to violate the sacred neutrality of the golden chrysanthemum, if someone had enough money and motivation to orchestrate this kind of public assault, then the careful balance that had maintained peace between the family for the past 5 years was crumbling faster than he had anticipated. More concerning was the witness who had inserted herself into the equation. The woman whose quick thinking had prevented his assassination, but who now represented a complication that required immediate and careful management. She had seen faces, heard voices, witnessed the kind of violence that transformed ordinary citizens into liabilities that needed to be managed or eliminated. He studied her through the office window as she finished giving her statement, noting the way she held herself with unconscious dignity despite the circumstances, the intelligence that sparked in her eyes when Detective Morrison asked particularly probing questions. She was not the kind of person who would simply forget what she had seen, nor was she the kind who would accept convenient lies about restaurant robberies gone wrong. The detective shook her hand and closed his notebook, the familiar ritual of official indifference playing out exactly as Jinwoo had expected. Within an hour, Zara Williams would walk out of the golden chrysanthemum and return to her ordinary life, carrying with her the memory of the most extraordinary 90 seconds she had ever experienced. Except that returning to her ordinary life was no longer an option. Jinwoo moved through the restaurant's administrative area with a quiet authority that parted crowds and opened doors without him needing to ask. The manager, a nervous man named Chun who had built his reputation on discretion and his fortune on forgetting the right details, stepped aside with practiced deference as Jinwoo approached the office where Zara was gathering her belongings. She looked up when he entered, and he saw recognition flicker in her expression, not of who he was, but of what he represented. in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the cramped office. Without the romantic ambience of candlelight and crystal, the reality of their situation became stark and unavoidable. "Miss Williams," he said, his accent lending formality to words that carried implications she was only beginning to understand. "We need to discuss your situation." Zara straightened in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her spine finding the kind of steel that had carried her through community college on a scholarship and 3 jobs simultaneously while caring for a diabetic mother. "My situation," she repeated, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that pulled at her features. "You mean the fact that I just survived a shootout in the most expensive restaurant in the city?" Jinwoo closed the office door behind him, the simple gesture transforming the cramped space into something more intimate and considerably more dangerous. "The men who attempted to kill me tonight were professionals," he explained, settling into the chair across from her with fluid grace that suggested predatory control. "They were paid well for the assignment, which means whoever hired them has both resources and motivation." She studied his face, looking for deception or manipulation in features that had been schooled to reveal nothing beyond what he chose to show. "What does that have to do with me?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "You witnessed their faces, heard their voices, saw them die," Jinwoo stated with calm precision. "In my world, witnesses become liabilities, and liabilities have a very short life expectancy. The people who hired these men will assume you can identify them, which makes you a target that needs to be eliminated before you can testify about what you saw." The words hit her like physical blows, each one restructuring her understanding of the evening's events. She had thought the danger was over when the shooting stopped, that the violence was contained within those 90 seconds of chaos and gunfire. The realization that it was only beginning, that her decision to protect a stranger had painted a target on her back, settled around her like ice water. "You don't know that," she said, but the protest lacked conviction. "I'm nobody special, just a waitress who was in the wrong place at the wrong time." Jinwoo's expression softened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his controlled facade, revealing something that might have been sympathy. "In my world, Miss Williams, being in the wrong place at the wrong time is often a fatal condition. The men who want me dead will not take chances with potential witnesses, especially ones who demonstrated the kind of quick thinking you showed tonight." The office felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing inward as the weight of her new reality settled around her shoulders like a lead blanket. She thought of her mother's evening medications, of the electric bill due next week, of the normal life that seemed to be dissolving around her like sugar in rain. "So what are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "That I go into hiding because I helped save your life?" Jinwoo leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes holding hers with steady intensity. "I am suggesting that you accept my protection," he said, the words carrying the weight of both offer and ultimatum. "My compound is secure, my security is absolute, and my motivation to keep you safe is now aligned with my motivation to stay alive." The word compound conjured images that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with captivity, beautiful prisons wrapped in silk and maintained by men with guns. "Protection," she repeated, testing the word on her tongue and finding it bitter. "You mean imprisonment?" "I mean survival," Jinwoo corrected, his tone remaining level despite the accusation in her voice. "The alternative is returning to your apartment, your job, your normal routine, and hoping that whoever hired tonight's assassins decides you are not worth the risk of leaving alive." Zara stood abruptly, the plastic chair scraping against linoleum as she began pacing the small confines of the office. "This is insane," she said, her hands cutting through the air as she spoke. "I serve tables, I take care of my mother, I mind my own business. I don't belong in your world of compounds and security details and people who kill witnesses." Jinwoo rose with fluid grace, his presence filling the small space in ways that had nothing to do with physical size. "You belonged to my world the moment you chose to save my life," he said quietly. "That choice, noble as it was, has consequences that extend beyond tonight." She turned to face him, fire sparking in her dark eyes. "So I'm supposed to just disappear from my life, abandon everything I've built, because some stranger with a gun might decide I'm a problem?" The silence stretched between them, weighted with unspoken realities and impossible choices. Jinwoo studied her face, noting the way fear and anger warred in her expression, the strength that kept her spine straight despite the overwhelming nature of what he was asking. "Your mother," he said finally, the words delivered with careful precision. "Margaret Williams, age 57, diagnosed with type 2 diabetes 3 years ago. She lives at 1247 Maple Street, apartment 4B, and depends on your income for her medication and care." The blood drained from Zara's face as the implications hit her with crushing force. It was not a threat, not exactly, but it was a demonstration of how thoroughly her privacy had been stripped away, how completely her normal life had become an illusion she could no longer maintain. "You investigated me," she whispered, her voice tight with betrayal and fear. "I protected myself," Jinwoo corrected, "just as I am now trying to protect you. My people can have your mother moved to a secure medical facility within the hour. Her care continued without interruption while you make the adjustment to temporary arrangements." "Temporary," Zara repeated, seizing on the word like a lifeline. "How temporary?" Jinwoo's expression became unreadable, his features settling into the mask of control that had served him through countless negotiations where lives hung in the balance. "Until the people who want me dead are eliminated or convinced that you pose no threat to their operations," he said. "Days, weeks, possibly months." The weight of it crashed over her like a tsunami. The complete destruction of everything she had worked to build, the careful balance of responsibilities and relationships that defined her existence. Her apartment, her jobs, her independence, all of it suspended indefinitely while she became a protected asset in someone else's war. "And if I refuse," she asked, though she already knew the answer, "then you will likely be dead within 72 hours, Jinwoo stated with clinical precision, "along with anyone who might be collateral damage in the process of eliminating you as a threat." The threat was implicit but clear, wrapped in concern for her safety but unmistakably real. She could accept his protection and surrender her freedom, or she could return her life and endanger everyone she cared about through her stubborn independence. "Some choice," she said bitterly, sinking back into the plastic chair as the fight drained out of her shoulders. Jinwoo moved closer, his presence overwhelming in the cramped space. "I am sorry," he said, and something in his voice suggested he meant it. "I am sorry that your kindness has placed you in this position, sorry that protecting me has endangered you, sorry that your courage has cost you the life you built." She looked up at him, seeing something unexpected in his dark eyes, a vulnerability that didn't match the controlled authority he wore like armor. "But I am not sorry that you saved my life," he continued, "and I will not allow your generosity to become your destruction." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications and inevitabilities. Outside the office, the restaurant continued its transformation back to normalcy. Blood mopped from marble, broken crystals swept away, the evidence of violence erased with the efficiency of long practice. Zara closed her eyes, seeing her mother's face, thinking of medications and rent payments and the normal life that was slipping away like sand through her fingers. When she opened them again, Jinwoo was still watching her with patient intensity, waiting for the decision they both knew she had no real choice but to make. "If I agree to this arrangement," she said finally, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was accepting, "I have conditions." Jinwoo's eyebrows rose slightly, surprise flickering across his control features. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate," he observed. Zara straightened, finding the strength that had carried her through every challenge life had thrown at her. "I saved your life tonight," she said quietly. "That earns me the right to set some boundaries, even in captivity." For the first time since the shooting had ended, Jinwoo Kong smiled, the expression transforming his face in ways that made him seem less like a dangerous stranger and more like a man who understood the value of courage when he encountered it. "Very well, Miss Williams," he said, settling back in his chair with the air of someone prepared to be surprised. What are your conditions? The Khan compound existed in a world where violence and beauty coexisted with unsettling harmony, where bulletproof glass captured morning sunlight like crystal prisms and armed sentries moved through gardens that could have graced the cover of architectural magazines. Zara had been living within its protected boundaries for 6 days, long enough to understand that her gilded cage was as much fortress as prison, designed to keep threats out rather than simply to keep her in. Her suite occupied the entire 3rd floor of the eastern wing, a space larger than her childhood home, with views that swept across manicured lawns toward distant mountains. The furnishings whispered of wealth accumulated over generations, understated luxury that spoke fluent Korean alongside perfect English, traditional aesthetics married to cutting-edge security in ways that should have been jarring, but somehow achieved elegant synthesis instead. She had expected isolation, had prepared herself for the kind of protective custody that involved locked doors and rotating guards. But Jinwoo's approach to her safety proved more sophisticated than simple containment. She moved freely throughout the compound during daylight hours, accompanied by discreet security, but not obviously supervised, free to explore libraries that contained first-edition volumes in 4 languages and conservatories where orchids bloomed in controlled perfection. The conditions she had negotiated in that cramped restaurant office had been surprisingly simple, though their implementation revealed complexities she hadn't anticipated. Daily contact with her mother, secured medical care without interruption, and the promise that her temporary captivity would not become permanent without her explicit consent. Jinwoo had agreed to each demand with the kind of careful attention that suggested he understood the difference between cooperation and submission. This morning found her in the compound's main kitchen, a space that managed to be both professionally equipped and warmly domestic, where the head cook, an elderly woman named Mrs. Park, had taken it upon herself to ensure that Zara's transition to temporary residency included proper nutrition and cultural education through food. The woman spoke limited English, but communicated volumes through gentle gestures and the universal language of someone who believed that most problems could be solved with the right combination of ingredients and attention. Zara was learning to fold mandu, her fingers growing more confident with the delicate pleating technique that transformed simple dough into elegant parcels, when she became aware of being watched. She looked up to find Jinwoo standing in the kitchen doorway, his usual armor of perfectly tailored suits replaced with dark slacks and a white dress shirt open at the collar, sleeves rolled back to reveal forearms marked with old scars that spoke of a youth less protected than his current circumstances suggested. The informality transformed him in ways that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the careful control, the person who existed when he wasn't managing territories and negotiating with people who solved disagreements with violence. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his fingers through it, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested sleep remained elusive despite the security of his fortress. Mrs. Park noticed their mutual awareness and began bustling around the kitchen with the kind of purposeful activity that provided cover for moments that needed privacy without surveillance. She pressed a cup of tea into Jinwoo's hands and gestured meaningfully toward the breakfast nook that overlooked the garden, her expression suggesting that some conversations were best held over food and away from the formality of offices and conference rooms. "You are learning quickly," Jinwoo observed, settling across from Zara at the small table, where morning light filtered through windows that could stop bullets, but still managed to feel like portals to a peaceful world. Mrs. Park believes that anyone who can master mandu folding possesses the patience and precision necessary for most of life's challenges. Zara's hands stilled on the dumpling she had been shaping, her attention caught by something in his voice that suggested the comment carried weight beyond casual observation. "She is a good teacher," Zara replied, studying his face for clues to the complexity she sensed beneath his careful words. "Patient with my mistakes and generous with her knowledge." The silence that settled between them felt different from the careful politeness that had characterized their interactions since her arrival at the compound, weighted with possibilities neither of them had yet named. Jinwoo sipped his tea with the kind of deliberate attention that suggested he was buying time to navigate conversational territory that required more finesse than business negotiations or security briefings. "My sister used to sit in that same chair," he said finally, his voice carrying traces of memory that transformed his controlled features. "She would come to the kitchen before school, helping Mrs. Park prepare lunchboxes and stealing pieces of whatever she was cooking for dinner." Zara felt something shift in the atmosphere around them, a crack in the careful distance Jinwoo maintained between his private self and the dangerous world he inhabited professionally. She had heard references to family during her stay, but nothing that suggested personal loss or vulnerability, nothing that revealed the wounds that shaped the man behind the reputation. "Used to," she repeated gently, recognizing the past tense that carried implications too heavy for casual conversation. Jinwoo's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his teacup, the only sign that her quiet question had found its target. "Minyoung was 15 when she died," he said, the words delivered with clinical precision that didn't quite hide the grief underneath. "A car accident that was not an accident, retaliation for a territory dispute that I had thought was contained to adults who understood the rules." The weight of his confession settled around them like morning fog, cold and inescapable. Zara found herself holding her breath, understanding that he was sharing something he rarely spoke aloud, trusting her with pieces of his history that explained the careful control he maintained over every aspect of his current existence. "She would have liked you," Jinwoo continued, his gaze distant as memory overrode present reality. "Minyoung believed that goodness was a choice people made regardless of circumstances, that kindness was not weakness, but the kind of strength that required real courage to maintain." Zara felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, recognizing the profound loss that had shaped the man sitting across from her, understanding suddenly why her instinctive protection of a stranger had affected him so deeply. "She sounds wonderful," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of genuine sympathy. "She was," Jinwoo agreed, returning his attention to the present with visible effort. "And she would have approved of your courage, even if she would have scolded you for the risk you took." The moment stretched between them, intimate in ways that had nothing to do with physical proximity and everything to do with the recognition of shared pain. Zara had lost her father at 19, had watched him fade away in a hospital bed, while medical bills consumed everything the family had saved, and she understood the way grief could reshape a person's entire approach to protecting those they loved. Without conscious thought, she reached across the small table and placed her hand over his, feeling the calloused warmth of fingers that had known both tenderness and violence. The contact sent electricity up her arm, but it was the way his breathing changed, the subtle relaxation in his shoulders, that made her understand how rarely he allowed himself to be comforted. "I am sorry for your loss," she said, the inadequate words carrying all the sincerity she could manage. "And I am sorry that protecting others has become such a burden for you." Jinwoo looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable, but something vulnerable flickering in his dark eyes. "It is not a burden when the person being protected understands a cost," he said quietly. Minyoung never did. She trusted the world to be fair, believed that good intentions would be rewarded with good outcomes. "Unlike me," Zara observed, understanding the comparison he was drawing. "Unlike you," he agreed, his thumb brushing unconsciously across her knuckles in a gesture that sent warmth spiraling through her chest. "You understand that choices have consequences, that protection requires sacrifice, that safety is not a birthright, but something that must be actively maintained." The kitchen around them seemed to fade into soft focus, the morning light creating a golden bubble of intimacy that existed separate from the larger realities of compounds and security details and people who wanted them both dead. Zara found herself studying the man across from her, seeing past the reputation and the careful control to the person who carried the weight of protecting everyone around him, who had built fortress walls not just around his property, but around his heart. She noticed the scar that ran along his left temple, barely visible but distinct enough to suggest violence survived in his youth. Without thinking, she lifted her free hand and traced the thin line with gentle fingertips, feeling him go absolutely still under her touch. "How old were you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 17, Jinwoo replied, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "A disagreement with my father about succession planning that became physical before it became educational." The revelation hung between them like a bridge spanning the distance between their different worlds, connecting her understanding of family complications with his reality of inherited violence and responsibility that came with bloodlines rather than choice. She could see him at 17, already tall, but not yet fully grown, learning that his father's lessons would be delivered through pain as often as through words. Zara's fingers lingered against his temple, feeling the flutter of pulse beneath skin that had learned to hide weakness behind masks of control. She wanted to say something that would ease the weight he carried, wanted to offer comfort for wounds that had never properly healed, but words seemed inadequate for the complexity of what she was feeling. Instead, she leaned forward and pressed her lips gently against the scar, a kiss so soft it barely qualified as contact, but profound in its recognition of his pain. She felt him shudder under the unexpected tenderness, heard the sharp intake of breath that suggested she had found a crack in armor he had thought impenetrable. When she pulled back, his eyes were dark with something that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch. The careful distance they had maintained dissolved in that moment, replaced by awareness that crackled between them like electricity seeking ground, dangerous and undeniable and completely inappropriate given their circumstances. "Zara," he said, her name carrying warning and invitation in equal measure. Before either of them could decide what came next, Mrs. Park appeared in the kitchen doorway with the kind of perfect timing that suggested she had been monitoring their conversation from a discreet distance. Her weathered face wore an expression of maternal satisfaction as she took in their proximity, their joined hands, the obvious shift in the atmosphere between them. She spoke rapidly in Korean, her tone carrying affectionate scolding, and Jinwoo responded with what sounded like mild protest, mixed with resignation. The exchange broke the spell that had settled around them, returning them to the reality of their situation and the careful boundaries that needed to be maintained. Mrs. Park insists that emotional revelations require proper feeding, Jinwoo translated, his voice carrying traces of amusement that transformed his features in appealing ways. "She is preparing a lunch that will apparently solve all our problems through the strategic application of properly seasoned soup." Zara laughed despite the weight of the moment, understanding that the elderly woman was providing them with graceful transition away from territory that had become dangerously intimate. "Thank you," she said in her slowly improving Korean, earning a pleased smile from Mrs. Park and something that might have been approval from Jinwoo. The sound of her phone buzzing against the wooden table broke through the domestic tranquility like a stone through glass. Jinwoo's expression shifted instantly from relaxed attention to sharp focus as he read the message that appeared on the screen, his features settling back into the mask of controlled alertness that she had come to associate with professional rather than personal concerns. "What is it?" Zara asked, recognizing the change in his demeanor. Jinwoo stood with fluid grace, the movement carrying him away from intimacy and back toward the role of protector and strategist. "Park just received intelligence that our location has been compromised," he said, his voice steady despite the implications. "The people who want me dead now know exactly where to find us both." The kitchen suddenly felt less like sanctuary and more like trap, the morning light that had seemed so peaceful now highlighting their vulnerability rather than their comfort. Zara understood that their moment of recognition, their careful exploration of attraction and connection, would have to be suspended while they dealt with more immediate concerns about survival. But as Jinwoo moved toward the door to coordinate with his security team, he paused and looked back at her with an expression that suggested the conversation they had just shared had changed something fundamental between them, regardless of what external threats might require their attention. "This is not over," he said quietly, and Zara understood that he was not referring to the danger that had found them, but to whatever had sparked to life between them in the space of shared breakfast and tentative honesty about the wounds that had shaped them both. She nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in her chest like warmth spreading through cold water. Despite the danger, despite the impossibility of their circumstances, despite every rational reason why attraction between protector and protected could only lead to complications neither of them could afford, something had shifted that could not be shifted back. The recognition hung between them, dangerous and precious, and absolutely certain, as the compound around them transformed once again from peaceful refuge into fortress under siege. The intelligence Park had received proved devastatingly accurate, delivered through channels that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime and painted in the blood of informants who had died to provide it. Yamamoto Kenji, the aging patriarch whose ambitions had outgrown his patience, had not simply hired freelance assassins for the restaurant attack. He had declared war on the Kong family using methods that violated every code of honor that had governed territorial disputes for 3 generations. Jinwoo stood in his private study, surrounded by monitors that displayed real-time surveillance feeds from every angle of the compound perimeter, watching for threats that could materialize from forest shadows or distant rooftops with equal lethality. The room smelled of leather and tension, expensive whiskey, and the oiled metal of weapons being prepared for immediate use. Park stood beside him, his scarred face grim as he delivered updates that transformed theoretical danger into imminent reality. Yamamoto has contract killers positioned in 4 cities. Park reported in rapid Korean, his voice carrying the weight of intelligence gathered through interrogation and infiltration. The price on your head has tripled since the restaurant, and now includes a separate bounty for the woman who witnessed the attempt. The words hit Jinwoo like physical blows, each syllable restructuring his understanding of the threat they faced. He had anticipated retaliation for surviving the assassination attempt, had prepared for escalated security measures and temporary isolation, while his own people neutralized the immediate danger. He had not expected Zara to become a primary target rather than simply collateral damage in someone else's war. How much, he asked, though the number mattered less than the principle it represented. 2 million American for you, Park replied, consulting notes written in the kind of coded shorthand that had kept them both alive through years of similar briefings. 500,000 for her, dead or alive, with a bonus for public execution that sends a message about the consequences of interfering in family business. The study suddenly felt too small to contain the fury that built in Jinwoo's chest like pressure in a sealed vessel approaching critical limits. $500,000 was enough to buy armies of desperate men, enough to ensure that every criminal organization on the eastern seaboard would consider Zara Williams a walking lottery ticket worth any risk to claim. She cannot remain here, Jinwoo stated, the decision crystallizing with cold precision. If Yamamoto knows our location, then he knows our defensive capabilities, our security protocols, the exact number of men we can deploy to protect the compound. Park nodded, having reached the same tactical conclusion. The safe house in Virginia is prepared, full security detail and electronic countermeasures. We can move her within the hour using the tunnel system. Keep her isolated until this situation resolves. The practical solution made perfect sense from every strategic angle, except the one that mattered most to Jinwoo in that moment. Moving Zara to a remote safe house would ensure her physical security, but would also place her beyond his direct protection, dependent on security teams who answered to his authority rather than his personal investment in her survival. No, he said, the word carrying absolute finality. She stays within my immediate reach until Yamamoto is eliminated. Park's eyebrows rose slightly, surprise flickering across features schooled to reveal nothing during tactical discussions. The compound is compromised, he pointed out with careful neutrality. Keeping her here increases risk for both of you unnecessarily. Jinwoo turned away from the surveillance monitors to face his security chief directly, allowing his expression to convey what his words might not. "She saved my life, Park," he said quietly. "She threw herself into mortal danger to protect a stranger, accepted captivity to ensure her survival, and has handled every indignity of this situation with more grace than most of our allies show during simple business negotiations." The silence stretched between them, weighted with implications that extended far beyond tactical considerations. Park had served the Kong family for 15 years, had watched Jinwoo grow from angry teenager to controlled leader, had seen him navigate threats and opportunities with the kind of calculated detachment that kept emotions separate from survival. The possessive edge in his voice when discussing Zara Williams represented something new and potentially dangerous in their shared experience. "She is not family," Park observed carefully, testing the boundaries of loyalty and professional concern. "She is under my protection," Jinwoo replied, the distinction carrying more weight than blood relationships or sworn oaths. "That makes her safety my responsibility and her enemies my enemies. Anyone who threatens her threatens me directly." Before Park could respond, the study door burst open with the kind of urgency that bypassed all protocols about privacy and proper procedure. Lee Sango, one of their youngest security operatives, stood in the doorway with blood on his shirt and panic in his eyes, his usual composure shattered by whatever intelligence he carried. "Sir," Lee gasped, struggling to catch his breath while delivering information that could not wait for proper channels. "Miss Williams, she is gone. Taken from the garden 15 minutes ago, while the perimeter team was responding to false alarms on the north boundary." The world around Jinwoo compressed into crystalline focus, every detail sharpening while time seemed to slow to manageable increments. The false alarms had been coordinated distractions, drawing security resources away from the center of the compound, where Zara had been walking among Mrs. Park's flower gardens, enjoying afternoon sunshine and the illusion of safety that had proved tragically premature. "How many?" he asked, his voice deadly calm despite the rage building behind his controlled facade. "3 vehicles," Lee reported, consulting notes written in his own blood where he had used injured fingers to record critical details. "Professional extraction team, non-lethal weapons suggesting they wanted her alive for transport." Mrs. Park was sedated but unharmed, left as a message that this was surgical rather than destructive. Jinwoo moved toward the weapons cabinet with fluid precision, his hands selecting items with the kind of automatic efficiency that came from years of preparation for exactly this scenario. The specially modified Glock felt familiar against his palm, balanced for accuracy rather than intimidation, loaded with ammunition designed to penetrate body armor and eliminate threats with maximum efficiency. "Park," he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Every asset we have, every favor owed, every resource available. I want Yamamoto's location within the hour and extraction coordinates for Miss Williams within 2 hours." "Sir," Park began, his tone suggesting concern about protocols and proportional response. Jinwoo turned to face him with eyes that had gone cold and flat, the expression of a man who had decided that certain lines, once crossed, required total and immediate retaliation. "They took her to send a message," he said quietly. "I'm going to send one back that ends this war permanently." The drive through Seoul's industrial district unfolded like a fever dream of concrete and shadow, abandoned warehouses and shipping containers that created perfect cover for the kind of business that required absolute privacy and soundproof walls. Jinwoo sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, watching for signs of ambush while his security team coordinated with tracking specialists who had located Zara's position through methods that balanced technology with old-fashioned infiltration. The warehouse where Yamamoto was holding her stood isolated among structures that had been abandoned during the economic downturn, surrounded by enough open ground to make approach difficult, but not impossible for a team trained in urban assault tactics. Intelligence suggested minimal security, overconfidence based on the assumption that Jinwoo would negotiate rather than risk his valuable witness in a direct confrontation. They had underestimated both his attachment to Zara Williams and his willingness to declare total war over her safety. Park coordinated the assault through encrypted communications that crackled with professional efficiency, deploying teams and patterns that would eliminate external security before moving inward to locate and extract their primary objective. Jinwoo listened to the tactical chatter with part of his attention, while the rest focused on controlling the fury that threatened to overwhelm strategic thinking with pure destructive impulse. 3 hours had passed since Zara's capture. 3 hours during which she had been at the mercy of men who viewed her as leverage rather than human being, who had hurt her just enough to prove their seriousness without reducing her value as a bargaining chip. The thought of her afraid, of her courage tested by people who respected nothing about strength or honor, made his vision blur with rage that required conscious effort to contain. The warehouse interior revealed itself through thermal imaging that painted human figures in ghostly outlines against cooler backgrounds of concrete and metal. Zara appeared as a bright signature in a second-floor office, flanked by 2 guards whose positioning suggested professional vigilance rather than casual supervision. The image of her captured and confined sent ice through Jinwoo's veins, replacing fury with the kind of cold precision that made him most dangerous. When the assault began, it unfolded with devastating efficiency. His security team moved through the warehouse like shadows given lethal purpose, eliminating resistance with surgical strikes that left no opportunity for alarm or organized response. Jinwoo followed in their wake, moving toward the second floor with predatory focus that transformed the familiar weight of his weapon into an extension of his will. He found Zara in a cramped office that reeked of cigarettes and fear, zip-tied to a metal chair, but otherwise unharmed, her dark eyes blazing with defiance rather than defeat. The sight of her alive and fighting filled him with relief, so profound it threatened to buckle his knees, followed immediately by rage at the casual way her captors had handled someone under his protection. The 2 guards turned toward the door as it exploded inward, reaching for weapons they would never have the chance to use. Jinwoo's shots were precise and final, eliminating threats to Zara's safety with the kind of brutal efficiency that left no doubt about his priorities or his capabilities. In the sudden silence that followed, he knelt beside her chair and cut through her restraints with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotions he was still learning to identify. Zara flexed her wrists where the zip ties had cut into her skin, testing movement and circulation while her mind processed the violence she had just witnessed. "No," she said, her voice stronger than he had expected given her circumstances. "They wanted me alive and unmarked, kept saying I was more valuable as leverage than as a statement." The confirmation that her capture had been strategic rather than personal should have provided comfort, but it only intensified his determination to ensure that Yamamoto's organization understood the consequences of threatening what belonged to him. Jinwoo helped her stand, noting the way she moved with careful dignity despite hours of captivity, the strength that had sustained her through circumstances that would have broken weaker people. As they prepared to leave the warehouse, Zara looked around the office where she had been held, taking in the aftermath of violence that had secured her freedom. "You killed them," she observed, her tone neutral but her eyes searching his face for signs of the man she had shared breakfast with that morning. "Yes," Jinwoo replied without hesitation or apology. "They took you for my protection. That made them dead men from the moment they laid hands on you." The drive back to the compound passed in weighted silence, Zara processing the reality of what Jinwoo's protection meant in practical terms, while he coordinated with intelligence teams, tracking Yamamoto's remaining assets. The elderly patriarch had disappeared from his usual haunts, gone into hiding while his organization crumbled under systematic dismantling that would continue until every person involved in Zara's kidnapping had been eliminated or neutralized. It was only when they were safely within the compound walls, surrounded by security that had been tripled since her capture, that the emotional weight of the day finally hit both of them with crushing force. They stood in his private study, the same room where he had received the intelligence about compromised security and looked at each other across a distance that felt both intimate and impossible to bridge. "I thought they were going to kill you," Zara said quietly, her composure finally cracking to reveal the fear she had carried throughout her captivity. "Not immediately, but eventually, when you refused whatever they demanded in exchange for my life." Jinwoo moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability in her voice and the need to reassure himself that she was truly safe within his reach. "I would have given them anything they asked," he admitted, the confession carrying more weight than strategic considerations or professional obligations. "My territory, my resources, my life, if necessary." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that neither of them was quite ready to name explicitly. Zara studied his face, seeing past the controlled mask to the man who had risked everything to ensure her safety, who had declared war on a rival organization rather than negotiate for her release. "Why?" she asked, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. Jinwoo reached out to touch the bruises on her wrists where the restraints had marked her skin, his fingers gentle against evidence of her mistreatment. "Because you are mine to protect," he said quietly, the words carrying possessive certainty that should have alarmed her, but instead sent warmth spiraling through her chest. "Because the thought of losing you made me understand that some risks are worth taking regardless of the strategic cost." Zara felt her breath catch at the raw honesty in his voice, at the way he looked at her, as if she were something precious and irreplaceable rather than simply an obligation inherited through circumstance. She had spent hours in captivity thinking about the compound that had become her sanctuary, about the man who had shown her glimpses of vulnerability beneath his controlled exterior, about the way safety had begun to feel less like captivity and more like coming home. "I stopped wanting to leave," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometime between breakfast and this afternoon, I realized I was no longer counting days until I could return to my old life. I was hoping the threat would take longer to resolve so I could stay here with you." The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning the distance between captivity and choice, between protection and partnership, between the careful boundaries they had maintained and the honest acknowledgement of what had grown between them during their forced proximity. Jinwoo cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with reverent gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence he had unleashed to secure her freedom. "You never have to leave," he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Not because you are in danger, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because this is where you belong if you choose to stay." The weight of his offer settled around them, like morning light breaking through darkness, transforming everything it touched with possibility and promise. Zara understood that he was offering her something far more complex than continued protection, something that required courage of a different kind than what she had shown in throwing herself between him and armed assassins. Before she could overthink the implications or calculate the risks, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, pouring 3 hours of fear and relief and recognition in a contact that tasted of coming home and starting over simultaneously. He responded with careful intensity, his arms coming around her with the kind of protective possessiveness that made her feel cherished rather than captured. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and looking at each other with new understanding, Jinwoo rested his forehead against hers and spoke words that carried the weight of absolute commitment. "Anyone who threatens you from this moment forward threatens my family," he said quietly. "Anyone who touches you declares war on my entire organization. You are under my protection permanently, not because circumstances require it, but because my heart does." Zara smiled through tears she hadn't realized were falling, understanding that she had found something in her temporary captivity that her freedom had never provided, something worth risking everything to keep and protect and nurture into the future they would build together. The final assault came at dawn, when the compound existed in that liminal space between night and morning where shadows offered concealment and tired guards might mistake deadly movement for shifting tree branches. Yamamoto had committed everything to this attack, calling in debts, and burning bridges to assemble the kind of coordinated force that could breach the Kong compound's defenses through sheer overwhelming numbers and strategic precision. Jinwoo woke to the sound of explosions that rattled windows designed to withstand direct gunfire. The carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction that announced Yamamoto's intention to end their war through absolute annihilation rather than strategic victory. The first blast took out the main gate, the second eliminated the guard tower that controlled perimeter surveillance, and the third sent a message that negotiations were no longer possible. He reached for Zara in the pre-dawn darkness, finding her already awake and alert beside him, her body tense with the kind of readiness that came from understanding that their moment of peace had ended and the real test of their partnership was beginning. She had insisted on staying in his suite after returning from her kidnapping, citing security concerns that masked a deeper need for physical proximity that both of them were finally ready to acknowledge. "They are here," she said quietly, stating the obvious with calm precision that impressed him even as sirens began wailing throughout the compound. "Yes," Jinwoo replied, rolling from the bed with fluid grace as automatic systems engaged throughout the building, sealing blast doors and activating defensive protocols that transformed their sanctuary into a fortress under siege. But they have made a critical miscalculation. Zara watched him move through the dim room, pulling on tactical gear with practiced efficiency that revealed glimpses of the warrior beneath the businessman. The predator who had survived 3 decades in a world where weakness meant death and hesitation meant extinction. His movements carried lethal precision as he secured weapons and communication equipment, transforming from protective lover into something far more dangerous. "What miscalculation?" she asked, though part of her already understood the answer from the cold satisfaction that had settled over his features. "They believe this is about territory or revenge or family honor," Jinwoo said, his voice carrying deadly certainty as he checked ammunition and tested communication links. "They do not understand that this is about you, which means they cannot possibly comprehend how far I will go to eliminate every threat to your safety." The compound's emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across their suite as Jinwoo coordinated with security teams through encrypted communications that crackled with professional urgency. Park's voice came through clearly despite the chaos outside, delivering tactical updates that painted a picture of coordinated assault from multiple vectors, professional military precision applied to what Yamamoto clearly intended as a final solution. 47 hostiles confirmed, Park reported, his voice steady despite the gunfire that punctuated his transmission. Heavy weapons, explosive ordnance, full tactical gear. They came prepared for extended siege warfare. "How many of our people?" Jinwoo asked, though his tone suggested he had already calculated acceptable losses against the value of what he was protecting. 18 security personnel on site, 12 in reserve positions, Park replied, plus civilian staff who are being evacuated to secure areas as we speak. Zara listened to the tactical discussion while her mind processed the reality of their situation. The understanding that 47 train killers had come to the compound with orders to eliminate both Jinwoo and herself, along with anyone who tried to protect them. The mathematics of survival suddenly became stark and unforgiving. 18 defenders against nearly 50 attackers who had planned this assault for weeks. "I want to help," she said, interrupting the military briefing with quiet determination. Both Jinwoo and Park turned toward her with expressions of surprise that quickly shifted to concern. "The safest place for you is the panic room," Jinwoo stated, his tone brooking no argument. "Reinforced walls, independent air supply, communications equipment that can summon additional support." Zara stood with the kind of natural authority that had carried her through years of managing multiple jobs and family responsibilities, her spine straight despite the silk pajamas that hardly qualified as battle attire. "I understand security and logistics," she said firmly. "I know this compound as well as your own people now, and I can coordinate evacuations while your men focus on eliminating threats." The silence stretched between them, weighted with tactical considerations and emotional complications that had no easy resolution. Jinwoo understood that her capabilities extended far beyond what her background as a waitress might suggest, had seen her handle complex situations with intelligence and grace that impressed seasoned professionals. But the thought of her anywhere outside the most secure location available made his chest tighten with protective fury that threatened to overwhelm strategic thinking. Mrs. Park and the kitchen staff are trapped in the service wing, Zara continued, pressing her advantage while his defenses were down. The gardening crew was working early shift and may be pinned down in the greenhouse complex. You need someone coordinating civilian evacuations while your security team handles the assault. Park's voice crackled through the communication system with information that made their debate academic. Enemy forces have breached the perimeter at 3 points, he reported. They are moving systematically through outer buildings, eliminating resistance, and driving toward the main residence. Jinwoo looked at Zara with eyes that had gone cold and flat, the expression of a man who had decided that certain threats required complete and permanent elimination. You stay within communication range at all times, he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. You follow evacuation protocols exactly. You take no unnecessary risks, and if I give you a direct order, you follow it without question or hesitation. Understood, Zara agreed, though something in her tone suggested she would interpret orders through the filter of her own judgment about what qualified as necessary risk. The compound's main communication center had been designed to coordinate both business operations and defensive actions. Banks of monitors displaying real-time feeds from security cameras that revealed the methodical advance of Yamamoto's assault teams. Zara settled at the civilian coordination station with quick efficiency, her fingers dancing across controls that connected her to staff members throughout the compound who were trapped between their normal duties and the reality of military-grade violence. Jinwoo moved toward the armory with Park, their conversation shifting to the kind of tactical planning that balanced available resources against overwhelming odds. The compound's defensive systems were formidable, but not designed to withstand this level of coordinated assault, especially when the attackers had clearly studied their capabilities and planned countermeasures for every advantage the defenders might deploy. How long until reinforcements? Jinwoo asked, though he already knew the answer would not provide the solution they needed. 90 minutes minimum, Park replied grimly. Our nearest allies are mobilizing, but Yamamoto chose his timing perfectly. We are on our own until this situation resolves one way or another. The reality of their isolation settled around them like winter fog, cold and inescapable. 90 minutes might as well be 90 hours when facing professional killers who had come prepared for extended siege warfare, who had committed everything to this final assault because they understood that failure meant their own extinction. Jinwoo selected weapons with lethal precision, choosing tools designed for close-quarters combat and maximum stopping power, ammunition that would penetrate body armor and eliminate threats with single shots. His movements carried the fluid grace of someone who had trained for exactly this scenario, who understood that survival required embracing the predator that civilization had taught him to hide behind masks of respectability and control. As he prepared to join his security team in direct confrontation with the assault force, he heard Zara's voice through the communication system, calm and authoritative as she coordinated with Mrs. Park and the kitchen staff who were trapped in the service wing. Her directions were clear and precise, guiding civilians through evacuation routes that avoided areas of active combat, while ensuring that no one was abandoned to face the attackers alone. Kitchen staff, this is Zara. Her voice came through the speakers with steady reassurance. I need you to move through the service corridor toward the main building, staying low and moving quickly. Security Team Alpha will provide cover, but you need to follow my directions exactly. Jinwoo felt something shift in his chest as he listened to her coordinate the evacuation with professional competence, understanding that she was not simply hiding in safety while others fought for her protection. She was actively contributing to their survival, using skills and intelligence that made her a partner rather than just someone to be protected. The battle for the compound unfolded with devastating intensity as Jinwoo led his security team in counter-assault against attackers who had clearly expected easier victory. Yamamoto's forces moved with military precision, but they had underestimated both the defensive capabilities of the Kong compound and the absolute ruthlessness of a man fighting to protect someone who had become the center of his universe. Jinwoo moved through the compound like death given human form, eliminating threats with surgical precision that left no doubt about his capabilities when restraints were removed. His reputation had been built on intelligence and strategic thinking, but the man who emerged during the assault revealed the warrior foundation that supported everything else. Lethal competence honed through years of survival in a world where weakness meant extinction. He coordinated with his security team through hand signals and encrypted communications, directing defensive actions that systematically dismantled Yamamoto's assault through superior knowledge of terrain combined with absolute motivation to succeed. Every enemy eliminated brought them closer to securing Zara's safety. Every tactical victory reduced the threat to her survival by measurable degrees. The turning point came when Yamamoto himself appeared in the compound's central courtyard, surrounded by his remaining fighters in a final desperate push toward the main residence, where he believed Jinwoo would be protecting his most valuable asset. The aging patriarch had brought a rocket launcher, stolen military hardware that could breach even the reinforced walls of the secure areas where civilians had been evacuated. Through the communication system, Jinwoo heard Zura's sharp intake of breath as security cameras revealed the weapon that could eliminate their remaining advantages. She was coordinating final evacuation procedures while monitoring the tactical situation, her voice steady despite the escalating danger that threatened to overwhelm their defenses through sheer destructive capability. Jinwoo, she said through their private communication channel, her voice carrying calm urgency that cut through the chaos of battle. Yamamoto has military-grade explosives. The secure areas will not provide adequate protection if he reaches firing position. I see him, Jinwoo replied, his voice deadly calm as he moved into position for what he understood would be the final confrontation. Continue evacuation procedures. Whatever happens, you keep our people safe. The silence that followed carried weight that extended far beyond tactical considerations, both of them understanding that this moment would determine not just their survival, but their future together. Yamamoto represented the last obstacle to the life they had discovered within the forced proximity of protective custody, the final threat to the partnership they had built from initial resistance and growing trust. What happened next unfolded with crystalline clarity, time compressed into moments of perfect focus where training and desperation combined to produce results that would be remembered long after the blood had been cleaned from marble floors. Jinwoo emerged from concealment with predatory grace, his weapon tracking targets with mechanical precision while his security team provided covering fire that eliminated Yamamoto's remaining protection. The rocket launcher discharged once, the projectile destroying an empty wing of the compound in a fireball that lit the dawn sky like premature sunrise. But Yamamoto never had the opportunity to reload, his war ending in the courtyard where he had thought to claim final victory through overwhelming firepower and complete commitment to destruction. In the sudden silence that followed, as smoke cleared and the last echoes of gunfire faded into morning stillness, Jinwoo found himself standing over his defeated enemy while Zara's voice came through the communication system with quiet satisfaction. All civilians accounted for and secure, she reported, her tone carrying professional competence that had remained steady throughout the entire assault. No casualties among non-combatants. All threats neutralized, compound secured. Jinwoo felt something profound settle in his chest as he processed her words, understanding that she had not simply survived the attack, but had actively contributed to their victory through intelligence and courage that proved her worth as partner rather than protected asset. She had faced the same danger he had confronted, had made decisions under fire that saved lives and secured their future together. When he found her in the communication center, still coordinating with security teams and civilian staff, she looked up at him with eyes that held steady recognition of what they had survived together and what it meant for everything that came next. The compound around them bore scars of violence that would take months to repair, but the foundation of what they had built together had emerged stronger than before. I was wrong, Jinwoo said quietly, moving closer to where she sat surrounded by equipment that had helped coordinate their survival. About what? Zara asked, though something in her expression suggested she already understood. I thought my job was to protect you, he replied, his voice carrying newfound understanding that transformed his earlier assumptions about their relationship. But tonight you protected me, protected all of us, through strength I did not fully recognize until I saw you under pressure. Zara stood with fluid grace, moving into his arms with natural certainty that spoke of partnership rather than dependency. We protect each other, she said simply. That is what makes this work, what makes this real. The sunrise that broke over the compound revealed a world transformed by violence, but not destroyed by it, where two people had found something worth fighting for in circumstances that should have driven them apart. Jinwoo understood that Yamamoto's final assault had eliminated more than just external threats, had burned away the last pretenses about protection and captivity to reveal the truth they had been moving towards since that first night in the Golden Chrysanthemum. What they had built together was stronger than the forces that had tried to destroy it, deeper than the circumstances that had created it, more permanent than the danger that had originally justified it. The compound settled into peaceful silence for the first time in weeks. Morning sunlight streaming through windows that no longer needed to watch for threats that would never materialize again. Yamamoto's organization had dissolved the moment their patriarch fell, his surviving lieutenants either dead or fled to territories where the Kong name carried enough weight to ensure they would never again consider revenge a viable option. Zara stood in Jinwoo's private study, surrounded by monitors that now displayed gardens and peaceful courtyards instead of tactical positions and threat assessments, watching him coordinate the final details of their security rather than their survival. The man who had become a predator protecting his territory was transforming back into the strategic leader who had built an empire through intelligence and careful planning rather than pure violence. The change fascinated her, this ability to shift between roles as circumstances required, to be both the gentleman who folded dumplings with elderly kitchen staff and the lethal force who had eliminated an entire criminal organization to ensure her safety. She was beginning to understand that his control was not about suppression, but about choosing which aspects of his nature to reveal, depending on what each moment demanded. It is finished, Jinwoo said quietly, ending his final communication with intelligence networks that would spend months ensuring that no remnants of Yamamoto's operation could threaten their peace. Every enemy eliminated, every debt settled, every loose and secured. Zara nodded, though something in her expression suggested that finishing the external threats was only the beginning of what they needed to discuss. The protective arrangement that had brought them together no longer served any practical purpose, which meant they needed to address what their relationship had become and what they wanted it to become going forward. She had been thinking about this conversation for days, weighing the complexity of emotions that had grown from initial resistance through forced proximity to something that felt like coming home. The woman who had thrown herself between Jinwoo and armed assassins to save a stranger had evolved into someone who could not imagine building a life anywhere else, with anyone else. The contracts, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was raising. The protective arrangement we agreed to in the restaurant office. With Yamamoto dead and his organization destroyed, there is no longer any external threat that justifies my captivity. Jinwoo turned away from the monitors to face her directly, his expression unreadable as he processed the implications of what she was saying. You are correct, he agreed, his voice carefully neutral. The circumstances that brought you here no longer exist. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibilities that neither of them had yet named explicitly. Zara understood that he was waiting for her to define the terms of what came next, respecting her agency in ways that transformed their original power dynamic into something approaching equality. I want you to formally release me from the arrangement, she said, her words carrying more weight than simple legal terminology. I want you to dissolve the contracts, eliminate the obligation, give me complete freedom to choose what happens next. Something flickered across Jinwoo's features, an emotion too complex to easily identify, but carrying traces of both hope and fear in equal measure. The formal dissolution would remove every external justification for her presence in his life, would make her choice to stay or leave entirely her own decision based on what she wanted rather than what circumstances demanded. Very well, he said, moving to the desk where legal documents waited in files that had been prepared for exactly this eventuality. The protective custody agreement is hereby dissolved, Miss Williams. You are free to return to your previous life, free to leave this compound, free to make choices based entirely on your own desires and priorities. He signed documents with the same controlled precision he brought to every significant decision, his fountain pen moving across expensive paper that transformed legal obligations into historical artifacts. When he finished, he set the pen aside and looked at her with steady attention that revealed nothing about what he hoped her response would be. Zara felt a profound shift settle in her chest as she watched him formally return her freedom, understanding that this moment changed everything about their relationship from the foundation up. She was no longer a protected witness, but a woman with complete autonomy, choosing how to spend her life and with whom to build her future. "Thank you," she said quietly, accepting the documents that proved her liberation from every external constraint. "Now I have something to ask you." Jinwoo's eyebrows rose slightly, curiosity replacing the careful neutrality that had marked his expression during the formal dissolution. "What is it that you wish to ask?" he said. Zara moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the warmth that radiated from his body despite the controlled distance he maintained. "Will you marry me?" she asked, her voice carrying absolute conviction despite the unconventional nature of her proposal. The question hung between them like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, transforming the atmosphere of the study from formal conclusion to intimate beginning. Jinwoo went absolutely still, his breathing changing as he processed what she was offering him, what she was choosing despite having every opportunity to walk away from his dangerous world. "You want to stay," he said, the words carrying wonder and disbelief in equal measure. "I want to build a life with you," Zara corrected, her voice gaining strength as she spoke the truth that had been growing in her heart since their first breakfast together. "I want to be your partner, your equal, your chosen family. Not because circumstances force it, not because contracts require it, but because this is where I belong and you are who I choose." Jinwoo reached out to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with reverent gentleness that spoke of profound gratitude and overwhelming relief. "You could have anything," he said quietly. "Any life, any future, any man who does not carry the complications of my world." "If I want this life," Zara replied, covering his hands with hers, "I want your complications, your dangers, your responsibilities, because they come with your strength, your intelligence, your capacity for love that is deeper than anything I ever imagined possible." The kiss that followed carried the weight of promises and possibilities, of chosen commitment that transcended everything that had brought them together through coincidence and circumstances. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and looking at each other with eyes that held absolute certainty, Jinwoo spoke words that formalized what they both already understood. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes to partnership. Yes to equality. Yes to building something together that is stronger than either of us could create alone. Yes to marriage and family and a future that belongs to us because we choose it." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the compound's main garden, surrounded by people who had become family through shared danger and mutual protection. Mrs. Park wept openly as she watched Jinwoo promise to honor Zara's strength while cherishing her gentleness, while Zara vowed to stand beside him through whatever challenges their life together might bring. Zara's mother had been moved from her small apartment to a beautiful suite in the compound's guest wing, her medical care upgraded to levels that ensured her comfort and health while allowing her to be close to her daughter. Margaret Williams had adapted to her new circumstances with remarkable grace. Charmed by Mrs. Park's cooking and impressed by Jinwoo's respectful attention to her needs and concerns. The ceremony itself blended Korean traditions with personal touches that reflected the unique nature of their relationship. Vows spoken in both languages to honor the cultural bridge they had built together. When Jinwoo placed the platinum band on Zara's finger, it carried none of the weight of captivity that might have marked their earlier relationship, transformed instead into a symbol of freely chosen commitment. Park served as best man, his scarred face softened by genuine pleasure at seeing his employer find happiness that extended beyond professional success. The security team that had fought beside them during Yamamoto's assault attended as honored guests, understanding that they were witnessing not just a wedding, but the creation of a partnership that would reshape the leadership of their organization. As evening settled over the compound and guests moved toward the reception dinner that Mrs. Park had spent weeks planning, Jinwoo and Zara found themselves alone in the garden where she had been kidnapped weeks earlier. The space had been transformed by celebration and commitment, danger replaced by beauty and threat replaced by promise. "Do you ever regret it?" Jinwoo asked, his arm around her waist as they watched lanterns glow among the flowers. "The choice to stay, to accept the complications of this life." Zara leaned into his warmth, feeling the solid strength of the man who had become her anchor and her adventure simultaneously. "Never," she said with absolute conviction. "I regret that it took danger to bring us together, but I cannot regret what we found once we stopped fighting it." They stood together in the garden where their love had been tested and proven, surrounded by the compound that had become their chosen sanctuary rather than her temporary prison. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with possibilities that neither of them could have imagined during those first tense days of protective custody and mutual suspicion. Jinwoo understood that he had found something more valuable than territory or wealth or power, something that made every risk worthwhile and every sacrifice meaningful. Zara had discovered that safety and adventure were not mutually exclusive, that the right partner could provide both protection and freedom in measures that exceeded anything she had dreamed possible. As they moved toward the reception where their new family waited to celebrate with them, where Mrs. Park would insist on feeding everyone until they could barely move, and where Park would toast their partnership with genuine emotion hidden behind professional composure, they carried with them the knowledge that what they had built together was strong enough to withstand anything the world might offer. The compound around them stood peaceful and secure, no longer a fortress under siege, but a home where love had transformed captivity into choice, where protection had evolved into partnership, where two people had found each other through circumstances that should have driven them apart, but instead had revealed how perfectly they fit together. In the end, what had begun as forced proximity had become freely chosen devotion. What had started as protective custody had become protective love, and what had emerged from danger and necessity had transformed into something beautiful enough to last a lifetime and strong enough to face whatever challenges their future together might bring.